Alrighty, y'all. So for many of you, especially since the type of video that I'm going to be doing, this may be the first time that you have watched me on the channel here, and I appreciate y'all watching. I'll do a quick intro. This is the Ellis Mowers YouTube channel. I am Casey. I just do this on the side, working on push mowers, riding mowers, and such. And at this point, I figured that this will be a good time to do a comparison video of what I'd call the 4 major brands that you're looking at whenever you're buying not so much a new riding mower anymore. I'll go over that in this video, but more so a used riding mower, say about 8 to 10 years old, a little bit older than that. Things have changed with manufacturers and stuff, with brands and whatnot in the past 5-6 years. The time this video is being made is 2020, so I'm talking about, if you're buying a mower that's probably pre-2015, more so pre-2010, it's kind of what I'm going to cover here. There's a lot of those on the market, still a lot of good ones on the market, and I wanted to kind of give you all a little bit of a synopsis and of just me over the years working on these. I took a break for a few years just because of time and space. Now I have a little bit of time and a little bit more space. I'm working on riders again, and I just so happen to have all 4 of the major kinds of riding mowers in here before I sell off for the spring. So I just wanted to kind of give y'all an overview of it, and I'll go down the line here and do John Deere, Troy Bilt. I actually do the Craftsman 3rd and the Murray 4th. If you're interested in any type of these videos and whatnot about lawn mowers, lawn equipment and whatnot in general, I do a lot of fixing them up. Buy a bunch of them, fix them up, new, old, really old, depending on what type of trade-ins I get. For more real-time updates, you can follow me on Facebook and Instagram at Ellis Mowers 09. So the channel name here on YouTube, add 09 to it. You'll find me on YouTube, you'll find me on Instagram and on Facebook. So I have a John Deere, a Troy Bilt, a Murray, and a Craftsman down there. I'm going to do my best to give you all a good comparison, just so if you are looking for a buying guide for a used mower, that you've got a good one right here, all in one video. So here we start with the John Deere to begin with. Alright, first one here is a John Deere. I've got a good list of the things that I have, pros and cons, and do I like them, do I not like them. I would say in general, there's not really, of these 4, there's not really I don't like. They all have their own little quirks and things like that. None of them are perfect by any means. But I'll start with the John Deere, and the reason why I want to do that is because they still make a variant of these. This one in particular is an LA 105. As of 2020 here, they make the E series, but basically, from what I could tell, all they do is change the hood and whatnot. They might vary a little bit of the engine options and whatnot that you can get on them. So this one should cover the L series, the LA series, the D series, and the E series, at least for the things that I'm going to talk about here. So first off, the pros, from what I've seen just using them, and just in my experience with working on them, as is the case with all of them here, is that these are some of the quieter mowers, from what I can tell. You got 2 engine options on them, especially these L and LA series. The newer ones, I'm not sure what type of engines come on them. I know they have Briggs engines. I don't know if they're more so Briggs engines now as opposed to Kohler engines. But on these older L and LA series engines, or mowers, they had the Kohler Command type. I think you got them on like the 110, like the L110s, and maybe some of the D110s. I think they switched over to Briggs, but the ones with the Kohlers especially are very quiet when it comes to operation, especially when it comes to deck operation. The decks are relatively quiet on these mowers. The Briggs are a little bit louder. but still, I feel like these are some of the quieter ones. So if you're not, going to annoy your neighbors, or you're living in a neighborhood like that, then look for the one with the Kohler command. It's usually pretty quiet. I've also noticed that these are pretty easy to service, especially like throwing deck belts and stuff on it. They're really not that difficult to do. I don't think the drive belts are too bad either. I have not done drive belts on these, but usually this one is a little bit different. But usually there's like a black cover on one, if not both sides, and it's relatively easy just to get just to take the little cover off, which is 2 or 3 screws. It's really easy just to slide the deck belt off of these guides here on the deck. So really not that difficult. Access is pretty easy with the hood and whatnot, and you'll see the difference in this versus the Troy Bilt that I'm about to do next. And it's pretty standard across all of the John Deere lines. You just have to pop the hood off. It's really easy to do. Then you have the whole engine bay that you can service, with the oil filter, if you have a pressure lube engine and stuff like that. The cost of entry of these is relatively good for a John Deere. I mean, it's like, you can buy a John Deere. This LA 105 new was $1,500. So this is the bare bones entry level, has the 5-speed transaxle on it. All the rest of them, like 110 and up, have the pedal operated hydrostatic on them. Low entry cost for a John Deere. You can get it serviced at a John Deere dealer if there's one close to you. With the low cost of entry comes the negatives as well, but we'll get to that in just a second. The thick deck. These decks are very thick, especially for a residential mower. You're hardly ever going to see, you're going to see a ton of surface rust on them. I'll get that out in just a second. But in terms of deck thickness, they're probably about twice as thick as what you'll find on most residential mowers, say like a Troy Bilt or even a Murray over there, and some of the Craftsmans. So if you're looking for a thick deck, John Deere is the way to go on that. Now, I think I've got on most of the positives and whatnot. The negatives, I'll continue the deck theme here. On the deck, with the thick deck comes the compromise of that John Deere did not do a very good job with deck brackets. They only have 3 deck brackets here. It's very easy to actually take the deck off. It's just maybe like 4 or 5 pins and taking off the deck cable, and you're able to slide it out. So in terms of serviceability of the deck and taking it off, it's very easy. But in terms of durability of the deck, when it comes to brackets and mounting points, it's not very good. So that's one of the other negatives about it. Alright, so moving on from the decks, I will do kind of a cosmetic overview, and that's one of the negatives of this John Deere as well. As you can tell, probably when I was showing you the deck brackets and stuff, you see where I've had to paint. I mean, I don't really do a good job painting, but see where I've had to paint where a bunch of this paint was flaking off here. These mowers are very, very, very bad for the yellow on the decks, especially, just breaking off and flaking off. You even see them sometimes on the bodies as well. This is a composite hood here, so it's not metal, but I'm talking about like right here on the fenders. You'll sometimes see them that have like surface rust all over the fenders because the paint's flaked off. So the paint on these mowers is just very, very trashy as opposed to what you could get for the price point. So the cosmetic aspect is not very good either. However, servicing the deck, putting blades and stuff on it, it's pretty good for what it is. In my experience, I think these 5-speed transaxles are pretty reliable, but that leads me to kind of talking about, actually real quick, The seats as well. You'll see the seats all ripped up. Thankfully on this one, it's not really ripped, but you'll see these seats ripped to pieces as well. Now I'll move to the transmissions. The 5-speed, I haven't really heard anything bad about the 5-speed transmissions, but you only find them on the very, very low end, like the L100s, the D100s, the LA105s like this one is. I believe the E100s have them as well. When you step up to the 110s and above, they come with this foot-operated hydrostatic transmission. I have had 3 of them, I think, that I've worked on that have had that. I haven't had any troubles with those. However, I've seen a lot of other people have troubles with the hydrostatic transmissions to where I guess they just simply wear out, or maybe just not enough, duty for the mower. They're maybe very light duty. So the hydrostatic transmission, be cautious of that, especially if they've got a bunch of hours on it. I think you really start seeing them in the 300 to 400 hour range. This one's only got 160, almost 161 on it. So, if you're buying a higher hour John Deere that has a hydrostatic, you might want to be a little wary and make sure the transmission is good before you buy it. But again, they could fail without warning. So just like anything, but they seem to be a little bit more prone to it. If anybody else has experience about the hydrotrans, please reach out. And then the final thing I wanted to talk about, I've seen a couple of them with the front axle. I've actually been riding one of them before where the front axle is actually worn to the point where it just pops the E-clamps off and just has the wheel come off of it. So the front axles are kind of a weak point on these as well, especially once you start getting up in the hour range on them. I guess a telltale sign would be if the axle is either, got some toe out on it. That would show signs of abuse, as well as if you see it turning, if you see, you're turning and it seems like the wheels don't look right when you're turning, as well as if the wheels seem like they're a little sagging as well, almost like they have some camber on them, like you're somebody who lowers a Honda or something, has the wheels sticking out 45 degrees. Not so much here, but you'll sometimes see it, and that'll be signs of a worn front axle. So you just have to be wary of that. Good grease points overall on these John Deeres, though. So decent mowers overall, just a couple of flaws that really don't make them as attractive as they could be, especially considering they're a John Deere, and especially since they start around $1,500, $1,600, which is pretty good for it. So I think I've covered all that. If anybody has anything extra, feel free to add it, and we're going to move on to the Troy Bilt next. So the Troy Bilt is next. Now the Troy Bilt, this is probably the most common name brand you're going to find under its parent company, which is MTD. This particular model is a Bronco from around the year 2004. So we're talking about mid-2000s right here. These will change a little bit. I'm looking on the engine cover just to make sure. Good way to check on a Briggs & Stratton engine is to look on the valve cover there. There's a model type and code. The code is the third number. The first 6 numbers will tell you the year, the month, and the day that it was made. So this one was made in 2004, the 10th month and the 11th day. This is basically the same engine as what you're going to find in the Murray there, what you're going to find in this Troy Bilt, what you're going to find in this John Deere, what you'll find in many Craftsman's, Briggs & Stratton. They pretty much strap their engines on everything. Usually if it's not a Briggs, it's a Kohler or one of them cheap Chinese ones, which I would recommend not buying. Troy Bilt sells or MTD sells their type of mowers under many different brands. So get ready for this. It's you'll mostly find them on Troy Bilt. You will find the Husky brand, usually sold at Tractor Supply. Cub Cadet as well, usually sold at Tractor Supply and some other dealers. I think Home Depot sells those as well. Troy Bilt's now being sold at Home Depot And then some of the Craftsmans, especially the ones that have been made after 2018 or after 2017, really, they started making them. MTD started making them in 2011, and you'll see by some of the styling cues that it's different than the Craftsman I'm going to show you down there a little bit later in the video. So just be aware. Also, the Murrays that are sold at Walmart nowadays that have been made in the last 10 years, totally different from the Murray I'm going to show you in a few minutes. So today, if you go out and buy a riding mower, if it's not a John Deere from a big box store, it's likely going to be something very similar to this, just an updated version of it. I'm going to go across this version, and I'll do my best to tell you about the other versions as well. Cost of entry for these riding mowers is very low. Some of them are very basic, like 38-inch riding mowers. Sometimes you'll see them with smaller tires and stuff on them, especially at Walmart. You can get them things for like $900. So cost of entry is really cheap for these. Of course, they're arguably a lot more cheaply made as well. So the quality overall, I know we harp on quality of MTD mowers. For the riding mowers for MTD, even as of late, they're okay. The decks are okay. There's nothing really to go home to sneeze about, but I don't really see a ton of MTD mowers come in that have decks that are just rotted out to shreds. That's usually reserved for some of the Craftsmans, believe it or not. Some of the older Craftsmans that are not made by MTD. This deck seems, it's in pretty good shape overall. There's one deck bracket I've got to weld over there. I'm not quite 100% done with this mower. I just kind of mocked it up just for this video. Overall, the seats, out of all of them, they're probably second best. This one has a couple of small tears in it. This one hasn't been taken care of quite as well as others that I have seen come through, although it's really not bad overall. The parts availability of servicing these, finding parts for them, they are everywhere. They will be everywhere for a long time, because MTD is basically the main manufacturer of your residential riding mowers nowadays. All the other brands have kind of, except for John Deere, have kind of gone to the wayside. And overall, they're pretty easy to service. I actually did take the deck belt off of this. It was arguably a little bit harder than the rest of the mowers, but everything's pretty much right there for you to service and whatnot. And the way they have the battery box and all that, it's very easy to take out the battery box and service things like in the transmission and whatnot. For the weak points of these, I think I've covered all the strong points that I want to cover with them. Like I said, overall, they're okay mowers. Nothing to write home about, but, I'd prefer other brands over MTD. They're probably my least favorite to work on, just because they're, pretty cheaply made and don't really fetch as much money as, say, a Craftsman or a John Deere would. So, one thing I've noticed, I've done one of these, is that the steering sometimes on these, they're not my favorite. This one's relatively easy to steer, but the way that they steer, I'm just not really a fan of, just because you see kind of the way that it just seems like a lot of stress will most likely get put on the tires and whatnot. You're going to wear out the corners of your tires a little bit easier, because on these MTDs, I guess there's a lot of toe in or a lot of camber whenever you steer the mower. I don't really like that as much. I've had one of the steering linkages go out on one of these before, to where the wheel would just free flow. So I'm not a huge fan of steering, although you usually find the steering on these to be relatively tight, as opposed to, say, the Craftsmans. The Craftsmans are bad about loosening up. So the hoods on these older ones, now the newer MTDs, the newer Troy Bilts that kind of have the more boxy-ish style hood on them, those you take off just like the John Deeres or the Craftsmans and stuff like that. They're very easy to take off. This one's about a 10-minute ordeal. And you have to take a bunch of screws, 4 screws out, and then 2 bolts down here on the bottom to finally get this hood off, and it tries to come off in like 3 or 4 pieces. And the ability for you to, I guess, work on the engine and whatnot here, even though there's parts, galore available, it's a little bit hard to reach and whatnot, and even so much as to reach to change the oil filter. You see where it's where the hood is kind of hitting on the oil filter here. It's not the best. I think I have a little bit bigger oil filter on it, but again, just access to the oil filter and stuff like that is a little bit compromised with the way that the hood is. The deck overall, I know I told you about easy to service. The deck's very easy to get off, but one thing about the deck is that the blade nuts, especially if you haven't taken them off in a few years, they are very hard to get off. They're probably the hardest of the 4. None of them are going to be easy if you keep the blade nuts on for years on end. They seem to be the hardest just because of what material the blade is made out of, or the blade nut is made out of. It's a 15/16 inch nut, and it seems like it just rounds off at any sort of force that you give it to try and get it off. I had to actually cut the blade nuts off of this Troy Bilt to get the blades off to replace the blades, and if you don't do that right, you damage the spindle and you have to buy a whole new spindle, and it turns into what you thought would be a simple blade change that would take 10 minutes turns out to be an 8-hour ordeal, changing, finding the parts that you need, changing them out, and all that good stuff. So just be wary. If you have one of these, make sure that you're constantly looking at the blade nuts to make sure that they're not going to get rusted on and make it really difficult for you to take them off. So anybody else that has any Troy Bilt / MTD stuff, I will add one more thing. You find the transmissions I think are all the same. It's just a matter of how they're propelled. So I think it's more of like a poor man's, hydrostatic with the way that they do this. I think it's just a variation of the gear operated transmission, so to speak. On these hydrostatics, the brakes are pretty weak. I've never found one that has a working brake that'll hold, really. So, as you can see, I push the brake down, and then it just releases. So, it's supposed to be a parking brake that you're supposed to lock down. It never really does stay locked down. The transmissions are a little bit on the weaker side. You see a lot of these, I guess more so these than other makes, have the transaxles go out in them, just because they're really actually kind of easy to jerk out if you're not careful, because you can like throw it in, you could be rolling down the hill and throw it in forward, and then it just jerks to life, and I'm sure it's not good for the transmission. It's probably like doing a neutral drop on a car. Not really good. Anyways, that's probably most of what I have for MTD / Troy Bilt / basically every other riding mower that you find new in a big box store today. Again, I'm covering the used stuff because that's kind of what I have. Let's go to the Murray. Alright, I'll do the Murray next here. And these, surprisingly, I don't have a lot bad to say about them overall. Really the only thing bad I have to say is that they don't make these anymore. In 2005, right around that time, the Murray brand got bought out by Briggs & Stratton, and they slowly phased out production of these type of Murray tractors that really have been around for probably a good 25 to 30 years. There's not really much of a difference in design change from the 80s Murrays to the Murrays that were made. This one was made in the early 2000s. You started to see them transition away from this style of mower probably around 2005 or so, and they became a part of, you guessed it, MTD. But there's still plenty of good examples of these old Murrays around, and I wanted to kind of give y'all a synopsis of the mower. The big thing, I have a big plus about these things, is that these things, I don't know what Murray did in their factories, but out of all 4 of these mowers that I have here, these things seem to be built like tanks overall. I see Murray mowers that are just beat to death, and they still crank, they still run, and they still cut. More so than any other riding mower. And sure, there are other examples of beat up Craftsmans and MTDs, but it seems like every Murray that I run across is most likely beat to pieces, and it still runs, cuts, and drives, and does all it needs to do. My grandma's actually got one of them. That thing has not been taken care of very well, and just like sitting outside and stuff, and cut rebar and stuff like that with it. Just hitting things in the yard. These things are built like tanks, it seems. So if you want a mower, if you're not going to really take good care of it, these Murrays are probably going to give you some good service. And overall, they're very simple to use. That kind of helps with the fact that they seem that they are built like tanks, because the way the blading gauge is, it's a very simple lever, and it just pulls one spring that enacts the blades, and it's very easy to turn on and off and stuff like that. The hood, again, is easy to come off. It's not like the MTD over there. This one's got a Briggs engine on it. So they're all very similar in terms of engines and whatnot. The seat, the way that they made the seat in the summertime can be really, really hot, especially if you're sitting out in the sun with it. However, it's made out of this rubber type material as opposed to the vinyl type material, I guess, is made on the all the other mowers. So you don't really have to worry about it splitting or anything like that, which is really, really cool. Smart on Murray's part. Just make sure you don't light your rear end on fire in the summertime with it. And really, overall, I've seen on Murray's, they have very few issues overall. It seems like the blade spindles seem like they're pretty good. Again, just a very simple mower. It has the wide body as well, so I don't know if you can see, as opposed to the John Deere and whatnot. You sit a little bit higher on all these other mowers as opposed to you do the Murray. The wheels seem like they're a little bit spaced a little bit further out of the body as well, so you might have a little bit more stability when you're cutting. If you're working on hills and stuff, then you might find that to be a perk. But in terms of that, I think that's most of the positives on it. Again, very simple Murray mower here. Simple to use and built like tanks. Going to the negatives. Not really a lot of negatives for a Murray, in my opinion. You don't really hear a lot of bad things about these older Murray mowers. And I'm talking about the ones that are red, the ones that are black, that you find made from the mid 2000s on back. Plenty of good examples still. I've noticed that the serviceability, mostly the drive belt, is particularly difficult. More difficult. It's not really difficult, but more difficult than say on a John Deere, especially a Craftsman. Craftsmans are very, very easy to service, the drive belt. MTDs, they sometimes have multiple drive belts, but overall I think they're pretty easy. There's just a bunch of framework and whatnot in the way of servicing the drive belt stuff on it. Apart from that, servicing the deck belt's not too bad. And then servicing the rest of the mower really isn't too bad as well. But yeah, the drive belt in particular seems to be the most difficult. I mentioned you do sit low. It almost seems like it sits more like a sports car type deal, as opposed to some people like sitting up a lot higher. So if you don't like really sitting low, then you may not like the ergonomics and whatnot of the riding mower. But if you do, then you can enjoy it. One thing I found on this mower I wanted to also highlight as a negative is that the gas tank design, the way that it's mounted to the frame here on these 4 screws that kind of push the frame in actually whenever you put the gas tank on it. It was leaking around these. It was actually leaking around the seal here as well. I mean, that's just a product of a plastic gas tank, but it seems like this would be a weak point on them, so I wanted to at least highlight that as well. Again, I don't really have a lot of bad things to say about a Murray mower. If I were to choose one of the 4 here, Craftsman would be a close second, but I think I would have to choose a Murray. I cut with the Craftsman, but this Murray here is built like a tank. So, you know, if you have any other feedback on Murrays, feel free to put them in. We'll move on to the Craftsman last but not least. Alright, here we are with the Craftsman. You'll find that Craftsman is probably the second most popular name of a mower that's out there. They're made by, they're called American Yard Products, AYP. You'll hear that kind of thrown around a lot, MTD and AYP. MTD is kind of now ruling the roost for all new mowers, but you'll still find, if you're looking for one, the Husqvarnas, if they're still making residential Husqvarnas, they're made by the same company as these type of Craftsmans. Arians, they sold those at Home Depot up until a couple years ago, made by the same company. And some of the snapper mowers that are sold even in dealers now, but mostly at Walmart, the snapper riding mowers, they are still made by AYP. It's kind of a mix, but I think most of them still are. If you go older, I have a couple of older examples over there. You'll have Wizard, Weed Eater is another brand. Just the general look, and I'll give y'all I will walk around and I'll show you kind of a general look of what a Craftsman mower would look like. You know, the hood design is similar. There's one in the back over there. There's many different variants. I'm going to do a more detailed video of the many variations of a Craftsman mower here at some point. As you can see, all these are Craftsman mowers and they all look slightly different. You can just look at kind of the deck designs and whatnot and the overall frame design. Just want to give y'all kind of a look as to what all the different Craftsmans look like. I just pulled the best example out here for us, just to kind of give you a little bit of a synopsis as to what all of, you know, a good example of a Craftsman would be. So we'll start with the pros as it always does. Resale on these is generally pretty good. These are more highly sought after than even well, the John Deeres are pretty sought after in the used market, but in the used market, if you go to sell your mower to get a new one, Craftsman usually sells a lot better than, say, Murray or Troy Bilt. Really, they all sell decent, but Craftsman, you have a little bit of an edge. Never have an issue with selling a Craftsman mower. I've used the one similar to this as my personal mower. Cuts good overall. In my opinion, it cuts a little bit better than the Murrays and the Troy Bilts. The John Deeres do a pretty good job overall, but Craftsman's a good cut for the money. The value aspect, they're maybe slightly more expensive than you see Murray and Troy Bilt, but they're built pretty well. They're very easy to service. I mentioned that because I mentioned on the Murray that you have to take off a few parts in order to get to the drive belt, but the deck belt on these is really easy to service, and the drive belt, all you have to do is actually remove the deck, which is just 5 or 6 pins. Actually, for all 4 of these type mowers, it's not really difficult to remove the deck. Murray's probably the most difficult of all of them to remove the deck on. Again, that goes back to the serviceability factor. But in terms of serviceability, these are arguably the easiest of the 4 to work on, in my opinion. John Deere's pretty close. A close second. And I'd highlight MTD as 3rd and Murray as 4th if I wanted to rank all of them. Overall, they're pretty reliable. I've had mine for over 20 years, just a little residential Craftsman. It works pretty good. You find many of these that are 20 plus years old that are still running pretty good as well, cutting pretty good. There's a couple of service parts that I'm going to highlight for y'all coming up here in just a second. But and here's I guess not a catch-22, but the decks particularly, and I'm only going to recommend the ones that have the 12 gauge steel deck on them as good decks for Craftsman. If you can find one with a 12 gauge steel deck, then you're doing pretty good. Should give you a long life. Changing the blades out is relatively easy. Instead of it being a nut like on all three of these others, it's an actual bolt that comes out. And so since it's facing upside down, that usually means that the water can't penetrate into the threads, and so it's typically a whole lot easier to get and change the blades out and stuff on these, as opposed to the other three brands where I've fought tooth and nail sometimes to get a rusted blade nut off. Again, if you're changing your blades pretty consistently or servicing them, sharpening them, then you shouldn't have an issue with that. But again, if the mower's been neglected, then these are probably the easiest to get off. My favorite hydrostatic transmission, and the reason why is because you don't have to press anything to power it, is this lever operated hydrostatic transmission. They come with the 6-speed transmissions, which are pretty good. Nothing special as opposed to the Murray and the John Deere. The Troy Bilts operate a little bit differently, but I've already kind of highlighted some of the transmission problems that the Troy Bilts can have. You don't really see many transaxle issues on these other gear operated riding mowers, apart from the MTDs. MTDs seem to have the weaker of the 4 transaxles on them, but the lever operated I like because you can just push the lever and just go. You can pull the lever back and stop, and it'll stop the mower. You don't have to use the brake or use your foot to modulate your speed or anything like that. So that's kind of a plus. Very easy to operate overall. The newer style steering, this mower does not have it, but I have a couple of other mowers that do. The newer style steering is very good on these. I mentioned on the Troy Bilt there's a lot of camber and whatnot when you're turning on these Craftsmans here. If you look, they turn very straight, so you're going to have a lot of even wear on your tires and probably a lot more true turning because you're going to have more surface area hitting the ground whenever you're turning. And then as a result, it seems like these mowers are a little bit easier to turn as well than, say, MTDs, and it doesn't seem like they bind up as hard. So I think I've got all of the pluses that I kind of want to share. Again, ease of use. These mowers are pretty easy to use as well. You sit up higher on these mowers as opposed to, say, the Murray or the MTDs. The John Deere's are about the same height as this. I know I talked about the decks. We'll go into the negatives now. If you don't have a 12 gauge steel deck, you can sometimes have issues with the decks on these. They do tend to rust out if they're not the 12 gauge steel, and if they've been used kind of hard, or on wet grass and haven't really been cleaned out. The 38-inch decks, I actually have one over here, and I'll kind of show you. If you are buying a used mower with a 38-inch deck that's a Craftsman type, I'd almost tell you to run away, but you see where the brackets and whatnot, this deck is very, very thin. The brackets seem to break really easily, so if the deck hasn't been serviced or kind of welded or anything like that, and it's still the original deck and the mower's been used, because those are kind of getting into the older mowers there for the 38-inch decks, then I would throw out a word of caution. Look and inspect the deck really, really good if you buy one of these Craftsmans. The 42s are a little bit better, but the ones that are not the 12 gauge steel, I've seen some that have holes in them, you know, rusting around the bracket area, especially right here on the front right. Some grass and stuff gets caked up. So just be wary of the decks. Inspect it really good before you buy it. The steering, there's two different types of steering on these. One of them is, I don't know if we can see it on this mower, but it's kind of like see like the two different gears on there. It's kind of face 90 degrees. You have your two different gears on there. This type of steering, it's usually made before the year 2000. And if you're looking for a mower and want to figure out what year a Craftsman mower was made, you come to the back here and look at the serial number. And it's the day, or excuse me, the month, the day, and the year. So this mower was made 9/21 of 2000. Around the year 2002-ish, they updated the steering on these to a much better design. These tend to wear out and have loose steering very regularly, and then sometimes to the point one of the knuckles gets worn out and you have to replace it down there on the bottom. Especially, you know, if you don't keep your tires inflated and stuff like that. I can show you the updated design real quick on the updated steering. It's a big old, I call it the big old semicircle type steering. Pardon the mess. When I'm filming this is still kind of winter time, and I'm trying to get these things fixed to be ready to sold. But you see the difference in the steering type there? This one's a much tighter and much more reliable. It actually turns a little bit tighter as well. So an updated steering. Now, with the updated steering comes an updated blade engagement, and the blade engagement is another one of the weak points on these. If you have a cable operated blade engage, the cable operated blade engage tends to stick after a few years, especially if it's been left outside. So you have the cable operated blade engage, you'd have to replace a cable, and oftentimes you have to replace a spring on the deck too. So there's a little bit of a service aspect to the cable operated. The mechanical operated, they're a little bit more reliable, but they have their own quirks too. You have to sometimes slam it down in order for the blades to be turned off. But the pro with the mechanical blade engage is not tied to a safety switch, so if your blades are stuck on, you can actually still turn the mower on and use it. Wouldn't recommend doing that, but wanted to mention that. And the final thing you can see on this Craftsman, the seats seem to rip apart pretty easily, kind of similar to the John Deere's. This Craftsman's pretty good. That Craftsman over there is pretty decent, but it has the 38-inch deck on it. So I think that is all for the synopsis of all these four mowers. Hopefully you all have enjoyed this video and just kind of enjoyed the whole buying guide aspect of it. And hopefully I just wanted to make it as a one-stop shop for those looking for a used mower. The pros, the cons, the differences. If you have anything to add to it, please do. If there's anything that I missed, add it. If there's any difference in opinion, please add it. Just want to make it a nice little forum for everybody. So again, thank y'all for watching. If you're new to the channel, welcome. I do a bunch of ride mower, push mower videos while I fix them. And you can follow me on Instagram, Facebook at Ellis Mowers 09, and I'll catch you on the next video. And after filming, there's one quick thing I wanted to add. I know I mentioned that newer Craftsmans are made by MTD. The Craftsmans that I covered here, and then is the one out there as well, predate 2011. So they're made by both AYP and MTD between 2011 and 2017. The Craftsmans were. Now 2018 and later, now that Lowe's exclusively sells Craftsmans alongside with Ace, they're all made by MTD. So if you're buying a new Craftsman, look at my guide on the Troy Bilt and MTD earlier in the video. Thank y'all again.